Ahoy! It's your buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is Arcana, and it's a long one. It's running from now all the way through September 14th, and it's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, online or in person. Arcana is the code. And let's face it, everybody, it's summertime. It's fun time. It's time to get back together with your friends and family, maybe do some grilling and chilling and ripping some board games or tabletop RPGs. And for all your tabletop RPGs, board games, dice, and Magic the Gathering needs, look no further than Noble Knight Games. Noble Knight also has a killer trading program, so if you need to free up a little space on your shelf and add a little cash to your wallet so you can buy more games, Noble Knight is where it's at. And there's more details on that on their website. In the meantime, the code is Arcana, good from now all the way through September 14th from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. When he said, make mine Marvel, I said, but Stu, I thought you were more of a DC guy. Stu Horvath.
You know, it's funny because I turned into a DC guy 20 years ago. But my first comic book, my initial superhero universe was Marvel. I was a Marvel kid.
I was a Marvel kid too, but I mean, I was a Marvel kid, but also Batman and Superman. However, you know, in the, late 90s, early 2000s, when I kind of got back into comics, it was all DC. Mm-hmm. DC and Spider-Man. So I always had the two from the other company that I would follow, but mostly I was following the DC Comics brand until Flashpoint. But anyway, we're not here to talk about comics per se. Stu, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about the Gamer's Handbook to the Marvel Universe.
Very exciting.
Yeah, these are some of my favorite role-playing books ever. Patrons will recognize my enthusiasm for these books because I wrote an essay about how, as much as D&D got me into the hobby, these are the Rubicon that I crossed and fully committed me as a fifth grader to role-playing games. There was just something about the four original handbooks that just captured my imagination in a way that no other role-playing book ever has. And that's because I was in fifth grade and it was the 80s and I was just getting into comic books, superhero comic books, and I was just getting into role-playing games at the same time. So the collision of those two things at that moment in time, it's unstoppable. Like the Juggernaut.
I'm unstoppable.
Those are cosmic forces. And wherever you are at that moment in time, whatever is scratching that itch at that moment in time is going to be, if you're a nerdy person like me, a hugely formative experience. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, man. I mean, at that point, you cannot swim back upstream.
No, out to the greater ocean, you know?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, that is prime time for being in that age bracket where all your hobbies are aligning and colliding together. And we grew up at a very awesome time because, we had video games, we had D&D, we had all our different types of hobbies. And then when you have that intersection of them, it is like peanut butter and jelly, two great tastes that go together.
It's true. This is true. We've talked about this a bit about the edition wars for D&D, how everybody's sort of every D&D after the one where you were a teenager and you played it with the quality of the edition doesn't matter. The period of time in which you were a teenager and had enough free time to play, that's what makes the edition great because it's the one that you just immerse yourself in.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was 3.5. I was 25 years old, but I was in a state of arrested development.
As my wife would call it, Peter Pandemonium.
She ain't wrong, man.
No.
Shit.
That is a really important kind of stage setting, I think, for what we're going to talk about. I don't have a ton of critical distance on these books. They're formative books for me. So I'm always going to think the world of them, and I'm never really going to see any flaws. I do want to say that they're interesting because they reflect what I think is probably the most interesting period of Marvel comics for me. So the core four books come out in 88. And then there's four additional books that do annual updates through 1992. So these books are kind of covering the history of the Marvel Universe through a 5-year span. And that happens to be the span in which it transitions from like kind of like the hokier Marvel universe into the 90s, Liefeld, McFarlane defined Marvel universe. Those were the Marvel comic books that I really like lost my mind over, and I read them and I have zero nostalgia for them. I don't really particularly care for them, but I really like the stuff that came right before it, because it was like a mix. Like you still had a lot of that, the adultifying of comic books where stories were becoming more complex and mature. And I mean that in the real sense of the word mature, not just like the lurid masquerading as mature. I think that the Mark Grunwald's Captain America run right around this time is a really great example of how like it's still four color silly, but he's able to tackle like interesting political and social issues. And your crossover events are still like excuses to get a whole bunch of like weird superheroes in the same room to hit each other, like Secret Wars. Like it really is just an excuse for like big brawls. Infinity War too, Infinity Gauntlet, where you get the entire Marvel universe together so that Thanos can kill them in interesting ways, and then you erase all that. All of that stuff is like super fun and childish in like the good way, but there's also those strains of adult oriented storytelling that I think just gets overblown as we go on in the history of comic books. I like modern day Marvel stuff. Like I like a lot of the Bendis stuff, but I think that I think it was Jerry Conway has like this Twitter thread about how like adults are ruining comics. To sort of save comics, you need to like get rid of all of the superheroes telling like weighty adult stories and focus them back on kids, because it's an example of sort of boomers holding on to their childhood and not letting go for other people to have toys to play with. And I think that's actually like really kind of true.
So I think I agree, but I also disagree in so far as I don't think you necessarily need to go back to just kids. Like, I think you can still tell adult skewing stories, because I mean, all comics, back when the ones even they were for kids, there were things that there were lessons or things they're trying to kind of get across in that without going like Brian Bendis fucking existential.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what killed comics for kids, was because, like kids are smart, man. They have the internet. They see what's going on in the world. They have active shooter drills in their schools. Yeah. Like they can hear an adult story. They could wrap their heads around it. They're growing up. They're becoming older people as they grow. And maybe in some cases too fast. I don't know. I'm not a parent. That being said, there is a difference between telling a story that is more adult leaning, that you could look to and take things away from it, that's going to challenge you a little bit, instead of just like I punch this guy, and not be like completely unrelatable. Because what kid is going to be able to relate to all those words and message bubbles? Like, I really do enjoy Bendis's work, but man, sometimes he's too wordy and too existential. It's like, it's like, is Spider-Man gonna punch anybody this issue, or do I have to wait till like issue 6 where he finally fights someone after all this talking? It is like the Dragon Ball Z of Spider-Man comics, where it's like, okay, so you're gonna talk at each other for like 6 to 12 episodes, and then there's gonna be a fight that lasts not as long as it should, because you talked your way through it to nothing, to no end. And I think maybe that's the thing. Maybe it's not treating children like they're idiots, but not giving them the existential crisis that is your late 30s to early 50s.
Yeah. And I think that this period, this late 80s Marvel Comics, really hits that pocket really well, because like I said, it's a transitional time in comics where like the Alan Moore, Frank Miller kind of darkening of the material, which I think is interesting and good and valuable work, but I think that it hasn't quite darkened the colors on the page yet. And you can tell stories that are kid facing and fun, while also having like subtext without it being just like silly fluff. And I think that's the period that these books really kind of capture. They capture it because these are basically the monster manuals for the Marvel Universe role-playing game. Marvel the best, exactly. You can never go wrong with a monster manual. So Marvel Superheroes comes out in 1984. These come out in 88. And this is the first 4 books is basically an alphabetical index of all the major Marvel characters, which is like, wow. That's a lot of characters. And then it's a lot of minor characters too. A lot of really dumb characters. There are so many questionable, like the frog guy who has like the springs and his superpower is jumping.
Yeah.
And he's an idiot kid. And it's just like there's limited utility to him as a storytelling device in the comics, and even less so in putting him in the game. But I love the fact that they put him in the game. Everybody gets the same basic treatment, unless like there's some minor teams that get like actual monster manual size entries. For the most part, you get a big full color picture of the model sheet, some stats, and then a long character bio, which is basically 2 pages all told for every character, no matter how dumb.
Yeah, because, Frogman needs 2 pages of backstory.
Hey, he might not need it, but he deserves it.
Yeah, I mean, God, I remember the issue I had. It was like Spider-Man versus like Frogman and the White Rabbit, who was like straight up Rabbit. Straight up like Playboy Club, circa like 1979, early 80 drawn. Because I mean, there was that also like, we are marketing these mostly to younger boys, so we have to have something tantalizing in here.
Yeah.
So have you met the White Rabbit?
I feel like the White Rabbit also speaks to like this idea of shirking your deadlines to the last minute. That is a very strong aesthetic value, I think, in the 70s and 80s in comics, where it's just like these guys would come up with stuff sometimes at the very last minute, pull an all-nighter, whip out an issue that just, what? But it would all kind of work because these guys were all sort of functioning at the top of their game. They were just super talented guys who were doing it all the time. So like they could kind of like pull one out after a bender and it would still be amazing.
Yeah. So we're going to distract with this dopey frog guy, and we're going to cover the rest of the distance with teen horniness.
Yep. What's
plot? Spider-Man's going to punch one. The frog's going to fall on the other. Bob's your uncle. Uncle Stan's going to sign that check.
Exactly. And my editor isn't going to fire me. A lot of the heavy lifting of this was done through a series of comic books that basically did the same thing. It's the official guide to the Marvel Universe, right? Like,
right.
Same model sheet, same basic approach, except with like more like this has role-playing notes for the GM. There's sort of an understanding that a lot of these characters would be used by players in play, which is cool because, why play fake Wolverine when you could play Wolverine?
Exactly. Yeah. No one's picking D-Man tonight.
Although he's an option too, which is really great. Love D-Man.
Yeah, I know, but it's just, I've always thought it was like so funny. Even when I was a kid, it's like, was this Wolverine light? Like, okay.
Well, who's the guy with the pan on his head?
Oh my God. I forget that guy's name. Yeah.
He's like wearing long johns. Is it Forbush Man?
I think it's Forbush Man. Yeah.
He's in here too. It's a really fantastic collection. And it draws also from the monthly Marvel File column in Dragon Magazine, where they would basically every month pick, something that was going on in the Marvel universe and convert it into the game stats. This is how I learned about Scourge of the Underworld. A lot of Scourge's victims are in this. Scourge is sort of like a low rent master of disguise Punisher type who basically uses explosive bullets to kill equally low rent supervillains. It was a subplot in the Captain America comics at the time. He actually kills like 30 or so in by posing as the bartender of a supervillain hangout called the Bar with No Name. And for some reason, this captured my imagination as a kid. It's one of the reasons I got into Marvel Comics, just because like all of these, the Scourge is cool. In this, he's just like a guy in a white trench coat with a skull mask and a machine gun. That's straight cool for me.
What more do you need, man?
Yeah, nothing. You don't need anything more. But then the guys he kills are just like, it's like, they're so stupid. And it was obviously them just like cleaning the roster out. Like the guy, the ringer has high-tech rings, or like the melter who's got a belt buckle that melts stuff, or Turner D Century, who's like this weird time travel gizmo guy. And it's like all these losers, but they're awesome. I love all of those characters, and they're all also cataloged in here.
Sometimes you got to, clear the bench, and it sounds like he took out the entire job squad on his way out the door. And, you're right. Like, there are so many doofy characters from both like houses, from DC and from Marvel Comics. I would argue more so in Marvel comic canon than in DC canon, but like, yeah, the Melter, Jesus.
It's like some of the ones that Scourge didn't kill are still pretty, like Paste Pot Pete is like, I don't think DC has anybody on the level of the Trapster who's like almost cool, but really pathetic at the same time. Like on paper, he works, but in application, he's just like who is this guy?
Paste Pot Pete.
Paste Pot Pete was bad enough, but when he becomes the Trapster and he gets those thigh high like purple boots, it's just
that was a choice.
Oh man, well. It's just, there's so much weirdness. This just catalogs all of it, and through the updates, you get to sort of see the transition into like the McFarlane verse, which I feel like it was McFarlane and Liefeld were really there were other guys working at the time who bought into it, but I feel like those guys were the spearheads for the big change in Marvel, and I guess comics in general.
Lots of pouches,
not so many feet.
Yeah, I will never get past that one picture Captain America where he's got like huge cans.
Yeah, well, it's like the top of his chest shoots out far enough that he could like eat like his dinner plate, just perch it right there and like put his face in like a horse.
Yeah, the proportions are all off. Everything is like weird, but like you're like, oh wow, like you're just like, oh, it's kind of like a cool looking picture of Captain America, and then your eyes adjust. You're just like, wait a second, that's different. That's not how anatomy works.
No, not at all.
I failed that class in high school, and I still know. Oh, so like, how many books did they put out for this series?
The whole series is 8. You have the first 4, which basically gives you an overview of the Marvel Universe characters, and then you have annual updates: 89, 90, 91, and 92. 92 is the last one. They were working on 93 when they canceled the line. And I think the whole line kind of disappeared at that point.
So they're doing it yearbook style, which I think is pretty cool.
And it gives you like all of like the storyline, like basically Wikipedia of the time for like the continuity. Like all of the storyline developments are in here. It's really fascinating to read. It's all like a mix of brilliant and boneheaded.
Now, do they front load the thing where it's like all the big guys are in the first book? So you get like the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Avengers, Spider-Man.
Alphabetical order, baby.
Really?
Yeah. So you had to wait until volume 4 to get Spider-Man stats.
Wow. But I'm sure you got Spider-Man stats in like other boxes, right?
Yeah. So there were in the boxes and in all of the adventures, you had statted villains, but this was the definitive and largest treatment of characters with the most detail. And like, I think that the Marvel superheroes line is interesting in a broad way because it's not something that I could easily picture existing in the hands of anyone else. The original box set comes out in 84, right around the same time as the Conan Dungeons and Dragons modules. And the Conan Dungeons and Dragons modules are very much, I feel, a clear licensing cash in. Like they're not.
Oh, yeah.
Put a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger on the cover, have Zeb Cook whip up something real quick and sell it. It's not, there isn't interest in a sustained Conan line. It was merely like there's a movie out, Arnold Schwarzenegger, let's make some money. Right.
You get a third movie, we'll make a third module.
Yeah, exactly. Red Sonja comes out, there's a Red Sonja module. Say with Star Frontiers, there's like 2001 modules, which is like really strange. But I think Marvel Superheroes is sort of like the antithesis of that. I think it's a really robust line where there's a lot of love for the material that shines through. You got 3 box sets that are just core rules between 1984 and 1991. There's a ton of adventures, source books, the Gamer's Handbook. All of it just speaks to a designer level interest and enthusiasm for the Marvel comic line. More than that, it also shows you if you're serious about doing a licensed role-playing game and you're the biggest company in the pond, this is the way you do it. You go all in. You just put out so much content. You map all of it as detailed as you can. And like, yeah, there's going to be some crap and some cash in stuff, but like you're going to wind up with something like these handbooks, which are they're like a precious pop culture trove history book. Other than reading the actual comics, which is hard because there's a lot of them, this is the best way, I think, to get a distillation of 5 years of Marvel comic history. And it's so valuable because like stuff like that is so fleeting, like how do you capture an entire industry's moment? How do you capture the 80s of TSR? Like there's something ephemeral to it that we're lucky to have had this. And the only reason we have it is because TSR had a whole lot of money to spend and they were partnered with a pretty big media company doing it. And there was just a lot of material to mine and put in front of people. I don't think anybody else at that moment in time could have done it. I know Mayfair Games in the late 80s, 90s has the DC line. I'm not really super familiar with it, but I don't think that it ever was quite so robust as this. They have the Who's Who books, which are cool. But again, like, these books are glossy paper. They are really well printed. Most of the characters in this book had never been printed with such quality before. There's such a crisp cleanness to it because it was newsprint paper. They were crap paper back then. You can compare it to the comic version of the handbooks, which are, on newsprint. And it's just like the separations aren't good. Paper quality is crummy. So like there's a lot of soak in the paper. Like they're just gorgeous to look at. And it just doesn't get any better than this for the period. Like this is really like a marquee moment for the Marvel universe, I think.
Well, that's awesome. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on these Marvel books?
They're hard to find. One of the reasons I'm so interested in them again, I'm constantly interested in them. I got them at the end of the school year. So like early summer is like peak. I want to look through these books again. They were printed for 3-ring binders. They're bound, but there's like a strip of gum on the binding that you can kind of peel off, and then they just turn into like a pile of loose leaf.
Oh boy.
Which is great if you want to put them in a binder. That's what I did as a kid. But the downside is that the outer cover is just a folder, and that folder has disappeared for most of them. And I just finally got all of the folders to put on my nicely made books. You can find the books. They're just white paper wrapped pretty commonly. But again, like these are kind of rare just because like of the format that they were created in. It invites a certain amount of abuse. So they're a little expensive, and it's a bummer because they are pretty fantastic. And if rumors are true, me even mentioning this on the podcast is probably going to make the prices go higher. I don't know if I can really believe that. I still can't believe that.
Sorry, dudes. I mean, it's kind of been proven like several times over. So
it's correlation, not causation.
Yeah, I feel like maybe one of the bonuses of the Patreon is like we tell people ahead of time we're going to be talking about this week. So if you want to get in on the market, I don't know if that's like considered like insider trading of the RPG hobby aftermarket, but maybe we should start doing that.
I don't know. That's funny. That's a good idea, actually. Maybe.
Well, this has been another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I actually just shot the first 4 volumes and the Ultimate Powers book for 2023.
Very cool. So you can find me across the internets at John McGuire RPG on the Twitter, on the Instagram, and on the TikTok. I don't really post a lot, but I will be the more I have things coming up. Exalted Funeral Con is coming this weekend. This episode is going to air right as things are ramping up, getting ready to go to Exalted Funeral Convention. It's an online convention. If you haven't yet, swing on down to exaltedfuneral.com, buy a ticket. There's going to be a lot of cool panels, a lot of cool people running games, some other fun stuff that I can't talk about that they're going to be doing, which is going to be pretty neat. I will be there virtually from my lovely apartment hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. But I do recommend you check it out, Exalted Funeral Con online. Check it out over at exaltedfuneral.com. While you're there, why not pick up one of my books, 3-2-1 Action? We have Rocket to Russia, and they just recently got Escape from Point Nemo. So great place to get into the ground floor of some action. Stu, what's your book called?
It is called Monsters. Shit. We've been debating about changing one of the words, so like I got fucked up again. Monsters, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground: a guide to tabletop role-playing games from Dungeons and Dragons to mothership.
So if you want to learn more about Stu's book, join our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We have a behind-the-scenes look at 3-2-1 Action. We have a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, that long title. We also are running games for our patrons. I'm doing a monthly DCC game. I'm going to be doing a chill game for October. We want to roll some dice with you. We got a killer Discord community. We got early release episodes. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.